Oh, just thinking about a novel like East of Laughter that, I'm currently trying to sort of nursemaid or handmaid, I don't know what the right term here is, but like really hold people's hands to get through something like Taskmaster. And I don't mean that to sound
No, 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 I get it. Yeah.
but I can't, and it does come from a place of like enthusiasm and care and and joy. Like I like doing this stuff. But people have no idea what's coming, man. Like when you get into the later novels. And I was so shocked from my brief visit to the archives that, as far as I can tell, at least four, five, six of the unpublished novels seem to take it even a step further than the experimentation that you see in the late novels, which is already like, it's like, you don't easily throw around these terms, but like I'm thinking in a technical sense, like kind of incomparable, but maybe I just haven't read the right
Hmm.
stuff. But man, it's just the stuff, the places he goes, and the weird formal experimentations that he does, and that he seems to be doing because of that liar's aesthetic uh, approach. Seems to be doing almost off the cuff. You know what I mean? Rather than like I planned this out for years and mapped it. It's just, but yeah, it's there's so much more even than all the already experimental stuff going
Well,
on in the
he always
early
said too, like
novels.
he would only own up to writing for an hour or so every day. Like he
Hmm.
said he wouldn't write any more than that. Like if he tried to, he wouldn't end up with any more good writing.
Mm.
If he tried to push it more, so he would like end up watching TV or like walking around the block or he'd go. Obviously, was going to mass regularly. He had all these other sorts of things in his time, and so like, he would work in an hour and a half of writing, and but like the amount of time he spent writing to get the output that he has at the
Yeah.
quality he has is like, he did multiple drafts too. He was working on a
Mhm.
manual typewriter. It's not like he had a computer where he could just like
Yeah.
tip tap and like change a couple of things.
Yeah.
Um, so there's that to consider. But then, so I do have a past master quote here that is at hand,
Nice.
where Thomas is talking to Remrock,
Hmm.
and about Remrock and where he came from and this sort of like whole evolutionary heroic breaching of the surface of the water, and
Yeah.
and how for mankind it was too far back. We don't
Mm.
remember what a heroic feat it was to make it to land.
Yeah.
But Thomas says to him, he says, I begin to get the feel of you more and more, not in words but in old shapes.
Hmm.
And I really think there's something in there that Lafferty used words as a way of getting at these old shapes, and as
Mm.
he explored his
Mm.
craft more and more, he directly approached the old shapes more and more.
Yeah.
The words become a conduit. Rather, the words aren't the things themselves; they're a conduit to getting at these old shapes. And some of those, like you said, those unpublished novels are so dense with symbolism, so dense with compacted meaning. We talk about past master like the Hop equation in travel, where it's like these compressed little nuggets of story,
Uh-huh.
and you get these little 90 seconds bursts, and you get thousands of them. And like for him, it's like every little page is like one of those. He really is. Like, he
Yeah.
does serve as a metaphor for his fiction more and more so the more he goes on.
Yeah.
Later on, like he has this burst of novels in the early 80s when he's nearing retirement. When he in 1984, he basically retired. He
Hmm.
would revise some things. He wrote a couple of things, not very much.
Hmm.
But he had a real burst of these sort of like big novels, and you do get plenty that were published during that time, because you get
Hmm.
Annals of Klepsis, a personal favorite.
Yeah.
You get East of Laughter, you get Serpent's Egg, you get
Hmm.
Sinbad the 13th Voyage, and those are all really really good, and they come out over the next decade and a half, so it doesn't you don't appreciate how quick they come to him. But
Yeah.
even right before that, he was doing these novels, um, that are just really really bizarre sorts of novels. You know, Fair Hills of Ocean, which is sort of like a dolphin double agent novel, a triple
Amazing.
agent dolphin novel. You get the Iron Tongue of Midnight is really, really compacted. Dark Shine is really compacted. Like they're really difficult ones, and you get the sense. And I think this maybe starts with Not to Mention Camels, as you
Hmm.
sort of said at the beginning, where he's grasping at something and he's not exactly sure what.
Hmm.
He's not exactly sure what he's grasping at, but he knows it's important, and he's just trying to get it on the page the best that he can. And that's what he ultimately, he thought Not to Mention Camels was going to be a big hit. It
Mm,
wasn't. And then he ended up like his own verdict on it was like, you know, maybe I didn't get what I was going after. But somebody needs to. Somebody needs to
mm,
get what I'm going after here. Like,
mm,
somebody's got to grasp this. And I think, when I look back on it, I see, oh yeah, that's what he was getting after was like where media theory would be going for the next 2 or 3 decades. Like that's what
mm,
he was intuiting,
mm,
is where it would be going and putting it in his sort of fictional form.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, you get so many weird ones, and even some of the ones that Chris Schumm or Dan Knight would pick up later. Elliptical Grave is a really really dense work. A lot of
Yeah.
these are really ones, and that's where I think a lot of very exciting Lafferty work remains to be done. Is
Yeah.
so few people have read these books, so few people have access to them for one thing,
Yeah.
but getting those out in the world, and putting people to task on them. And I think this is where I think back to my Joyce studies. When Joyce is putting out Finnegan's Wake in little
Mm,
installments in tiny magazines, there's this
mm,
cottage industry of people who are mostly his friends.
mm,
Sometimes people he just owed money to, which is a lot of people. That they were just puzzling it out each time. Like, what does this mean? What is he doing here?
mm.
And they would break it down, to the level of individual phonemes, sometimes, or they would be
Yeah.
digging out like old Dublin censuses and things like that, and finding out where he's pulling from, what is he doing.
Yeah.
And those denser works can really use a body of people,
Yeah.
pulling at those threads.
Yeah.
What's there? Yeah,
Yeah.
let's pick up this page. What's going on this page? What's going on this sentence, this word? Why is this
Yes.
word here?
Yes. Yeah.
And I think there's so much that can be done towards that part of his career.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say that any of the rest of his career has been in any way exhausted. You know,
Yeah.
um, but there's from Archipelago, which was probably his first novel on, there's so much
Mm,
more to be done there. But
yeah.
yeah, the density as you go on, it gets so much more compacted, and you feel like with Finnegan's Wake, you sort of like start with the easier, comparatively easier sections, and you build up to the more challenging ones, and
Yeah.
it's not a linear path. That's what Lafferty is. Like you do start, once you find a way in, once
Yeah.
you get that hook in you, you find your way, and you're getting everything, and then you get to the point where you're just like, wow, this is really hard going. Like I know this guy, I know what he does, I know like how he goes about things, and this is really hard going for me, and I think it was probably hard going for him,
Mm.
trying to get it out, and trying not being exactly sure where he was going with it.
Yeah. You see, I think that so I've always had this funny thing with Lafferty where some of his most difficult experimental work, if I come at it, this happened a lot when I was studying, and I've been going to all these like intense philosophy lectures and trying to write papers and stuff. And then I go at Lafferty's most difficult stuff, right? I always found it to be like an intellectual holiday because it felt like
Hmm.
almost the same level of all that stuff I was studying, but crazy fun, like and wild and weird and hilarious and just so exciting. And that may not sound like a selling point to a lot of people, but it was for me. But even like when I checked at first with like Iron Tongue and some of the other unpublished stuff, I wasn't totally sure. I was like, this might be too naughty, too gnarly, and like, it's not. Is it even fiction? But as I sat with it for a minute and got through a couple, because that's all I could do is all I had time was to sample a few chapters, and I took photos, which I've since lost. I don't want to talk about that; it's too upsetting. But
We can we'll work that out. Talk to me off
but
off the street.
but looking back over some of them and things, I realized like it had that same quality. You just actually had to sit with it a little bit longer, even than late stuff like East of Laughter and stuff. But like it was doing both formal experimental stuff and like imagery events type experimental stuff beyond anything I'd seen in Lafferty already,
Hmm.
and a level of language use at this very like parts of sentences levels, and metaphors and things in there, natural metaphors and things going on that were just like beautiful. Like I was just like,
Hmm.
oh, wait a minute. Okay, this is slow down fiction. This is like sit here and like savor every little part of this because
Hmm.
it is there's been a lot put into this. And I don't know how he wrote them. And I know he did revising and stuff, but I know it seems some of it had to have come out at a breakneck speed. But I think that's partly just his talent. That's partly probably stuff that was building up in him for a while and was able to come out fairly mature on a first go and stuff like that. Because it really surprises me that he wrote all that in such a short time and it's so dense. But my point being that we're talking about how dense and experimental and everything, but I don't want people to misunderstand. To me, at least, it's still so fun. And I
Yeah.
also think it's awaiting its readership. And just one more thing to bounce off what you said in relation to that, it's your story with it suggests that people who love experimental approaches to writing, both from a so-called outsider perspective and over into the high, culture perspective of Joyce or whoever, you know, from both of those angles, and you can, in some sense, you almost need both to appreciate Lafferty. Um, People who are up for that kind of thing and even hungry for it, as some of us are, because I'm very similar to you with looking for that outsider thing or that different thing, that weird thing, and always have been. Um, when they land on Lafferty's work, I believe in the future to come, including some of his latest, most experimental stuff, they're just going to be like, what have I been doing with my life before this? How come nobody told me about this? So that's my little kind of bouncing off what you said, but also my little prediction for the future. Yeah, it's fun. It's very experimental, but it's very fun. It is very challenging in some ways, but the kind of challenge that some of us really appreciate and get a lot of pleasure out of in the moment. My big comparison has always been Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask replica, which I totally understand that people bounce off of. But I loved it from the very first time I heard it. And it did challenge me like crazy. I was like, but I was also like, oh, this is so good, like, so there's an audience for that kind of thing that aren't just going to read Lafferty and be like, oh man, his short stories he can pull. I'm sorry, I get so upset about this. I shouldn't make fun of people. His short stories, he can do it, but when he gets long form, and everybody has these crazy theories about how he was too much of an alcoholic to concentrate and whatever, and I'm just like,
Yeah, no, and he
I
never, he
really
never
don't think
drank,
that's
he
the
never,
issue.
he never wrote drunk. It was
Yeah,
just, I don't think he was capable of writing drunk.
right.
That in fact, like, he was very explicit about this. Like, writing was the thing he did, so he wouldn't just use that time to drink instead.
Yeah,
So I'm sure that he cracked a beer, like, when he was away from the typewriter. But as far as
yeah,
I can tell, it was just that, and it was just the reputation he got from the conventions, where he was like very
yeah,
nervous, very anxious, and
yeah,
that was how he sort of loosened up. Again, as much as he's like, there are pictures and the stories and everything of him, and he really likes sitting in women's laps. This
yeah,
is he really really liked that.
yeah.
And getting piggyback rides when he could, and
It
so
is,
forth. But when there
all
was
that
a
is in his fiction too.
robust enough to, yeah, and he likes big women. I think you can pick up that.
Yeah,
But he's I don't think I've never run across any account anywhere of anybody who said that he was like misbehaved.
yeah,
Like crossed the line in
yeah,
any way. That it was all sort of like high spirits. Even if he
yeah,
was fall down drunk. That
yeah,
that he did not do that.
yeah,
And that's at a time where there were a lot of bad things happening
yeah, yeah.
in genre fiction at that time. There are a lot of
Right.
bad people hanging out at those conventions, and many of them were not were many of them were writers. Many of them were enabled by very big name writers and had
Right.
positions as well. Which again, I won't go into any further detail in at this particular juncture. Maybe
Yeah.
another time.
Yeah.
But so I mean, but I do think, yeah, for him, he found this thing. It wasn't, it filled what he needed it to fill. And if there was frustration, it was because he couldn't quite get down what he wanted to. That's a frustration that every author has. Like, Dante famously builds that into the Divine Comedy and a number of times. His frustration is like, I can't. This is so wondrous or so weird or horrible or whichever it is, at whichever part of the afterlife you're in, that I can't describe it. And then he goes on to describe it. But I think with Lafferty, he's reaching
Mm,
for things that he knows, or and he has such an expansive mind, but there are beyond him. And he's like
yes.
getting what he can of them, and
Yes.
he more and more as he gets to the later part of his career, he's very conscious, like, of the time that he has left, or the ability he has to grasp at these things and trying to pull them down. I do think it'll be interesting to see, because like the next moment we have to sort of test him is in against the literary marketplace is when we bring out In a Green Tree.
Mhm.
which I say we. I'm not directly involved in the publication. I am involved in proofing. I'm involved in, and in fact, I'm supposed to be. This is my Lafferty task of the moment, as I'm supposed to be reading through the proofs and providing an introduction for In a Green Tree, which I should fill in is a quasi. It's not. It's called an autobiographical novel. It's really not.
Mhm.
It's a biography of a class of students as they go through life, as they go through school, as they get married, as they start businesses, as they start families, as their kids go and do these same things, and it follows. And I think by the time he finished. Well, he didn't quite finish writing it, but he was still writing on it. But he got to the third generation, almost to the fourth generation, really. Those Catholic generations can be pretty short. So he did, and so he published. He was never able to get it published by, a major press. So, so he got In a Green Tree out there through through Dan Knight's publishing.
Yeah.
No, to Chris Drum. I'm sorry. So, the Chris Drum booklets. So My Heart Leaps Up, which would have been the first book of a planned quadrilogy. He likes quadrilogies for some reason. The Dana Cosp one runs also a quadrilogy. But instead of it being published as one book, it was published as 5 chapbooks, each with 2 chapters. And then they did the first 2 chapters of the second book, Grasshoppers and Wild Honey. And then the project stopped, both because Dan Knight had things going on and Ray's health was starting to fade a little bit. And they just couldn't get to finishing up. But he did finish the quadrilogy, and the other books exist. And there was the first 2 chapters of a 5th one that he apparently started. It might have actually been the last thing that he was writing. I can't establish that was Shorty, but it would make sense from when it was doing it. But so that's being compiled. It's being pulled together, by Lafferty scholars or dedicated Lafferty readers. The 4 volumes plus the fragments of what exists of the 5th. And it's an amazing work. I hope scholars of Americana literature, scholars of
Yeah.
Oklahoma literature. It's a picture of Tulsa that
Yeah.
barely exists anywhere else,
Mm.
of this extraordinary town at an extraordinary time. When I talk about Oklahoma, it compacts very much, both for good and ill,
Mm.
all of American history into about a century. Because it didn't really get going until they broke all the treaties and decided to open up Oklahoma to settlers anyway. They broke all the treaties with the indigenous tribes, who were
Mhm.
already people who had been relocated, as
Mhm.
Oklahanali talks about very
Right.
extensively, from the southeast to the Trail of Tears. So they broke their treaties with them and opened it up, and then soon after, so Tulsa is a boom town already, and then oil gets discovered, and it just like blows through the roof. Like it's a place that you can see, like going into a town like that where anything seems to be possible all of a sudden. Buildings like these gorgeous 20-story Art Deco buildings are like going up seemingly overnight. People are building these huge mansions and huge ranches and things like that. Very just like full of excitement, a really boom
Mm.
town,
Yeah.
in a way that very few places were. And you can sort of see the effects of that, and get the sense of place, even in the stuff that's not about that.
Yes.
And that carries through In a Green Tree. The In a Green Tree being the overarching title for the entire set
Mhm.
of books. And you get a sense of them. But again, it's a book about Catholic school kids. Most, not all of whom remain very like steadfast conservative, as we would consider them, conservative Catholics. It's a book about largely people who have no issues with making and keeping and spending money.
Mm.
It's a book about there are again some of his uneasiness, some of his less charitable moments, certainly,
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
uh, um, especially queer people,
Mm.
is going to be there. There's
Mm.
some very very straightforward, I mean outright McCarthyite sort of ideas
Wow.
of the politics there, that he
Wow.
was not just sort of like the anti-communism that you would expect of a Catholic. That was the sort of the great rivalry. That was how he always pitched it. Like
Mm.
if you didn't have the one thing, if you didn't have the church, then you would have to have the other. That's
Huh.
it. Those are the only 2 options for
Right.
Lafferty. But yeah, and which sort of I think led him into a McCarthyism. Um, and so there's going to be some really tough things in there.
Okay,
There's going to be some
that's
really
good to
rough
know.
things in there. And which is my challenge, is just to sort of set the stage for that, but also I
Yeah.
think to appreciate it as a really remarkable look at a place
Mm.
over 60, 70 years. And you get hints of this Tulsa in places. I especially think of it in Fourth Mansions. You get it early on in the book. When you go
Yep.
to the north side of Tulsa and everything's
Yes. Oh,
rough
I
and
love
tough
that stuff.
and everything. You get it in Reefs of Earth a little bit, like it's more
Yep.
rural Oklahoma.
Yep.
You get some of it
Yep.
in there. But there's a lot of that stuff in there. But like this is just like him growing up, and he's erasing himself. He very very clearly erases himself from there. Some of the material pairs with what we would see later in the Laugh and the Men Who Knew Everything stories,
Hmm.
where he comes back into this, he puts himself back into the story as the man who doesn't
Right.
know everything, and he hangs
Right.
out with these geniuses. Those are just the boys he grew up with,
Yeah.
basically. Those are his
Yeah.
friends from that era. But he does it with a different lens. Like they're
Yeah.
less science fictional. They're less funny in a lot of ways. I don't mean funny in like they're still very funny in many cases, but like there's sort of a deep sadness. There's also a
Mhm.
deep sense of a culture that parts of it are being lost, and of,
Mhm.
of grief that comes to individual families. It gives a different perspective on characters like Barnaby Sheen and those ones, and you see
Mm.
other parts of their life that are maybe glanced at in some of their stories, but not
Mm.
really dug into in the sort of like the detail and
Yeah.
that is brought out into this. So it will be interesting to see if that makes any splash at all. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what to expect from it. It's a because it's going to be like this side publication,
Yeah.
by dedicated fans, but fans all the same. And subject matter that might not be to a lot of people's taste, even if
Yeah.
the writing remains as good as ever. It'll be really interesting to see what happens
Yeah.
there.
Well, obviously, it's going to be a big deal to longtime hardcore Lafferty fanatics. And we'll see if it spreads beyond that. But I will let me add a little bit to your portrait of it. I've only read the first couple of chapbooks of it, and it's been a while. But I will say, first of all, I was surprised to find that once again, Lafferty is such a restless artist. But once again, it struck me as just a little bit different than almost anything else I've read by him. Like it definitely
Yeah.
has qualities of, you know, what's the first book, Archipelago in the Argo mythos?
Yep.
Yeah, and stuff like that, or I don't know, some of his sort of historical stuff, or some of his regional stuff like Reefs of Earth or something, et cetera, et cetera. But it felt different. It's all, when you're talking about him erasing himself, it's almost like he's Bad John, who's like hovering
Yeah.
there,
Yeah.
sort of. And Bad John becomes, this is from Reefs of Earth. He's like a ghost kid. It's like, and he's only mentioned, but it's like in a Green Tree, he becomes the narrator. He's just like invisible and watching all these classmates and stuff. But also, as to like whether it's science fiction or anything, it's not science fiction, and it's not quite magical realism either, but it is chock full of myth and magic on some
Hmm.
level. I don't even know how to describe what he's doing with it, but it is wonderful in that regard. And the little meditations that it gets into are strange and wonderful, and like things I lock onto. There's some like wonderful like monster theory in there and stuff,
Hmm.
and some of the early scenes that kind of involve like liturgy and stuff that kind of like start to like call out to like Catholicism in Mexico and all these kinds of things are
Yep.
quite beautiful. And so I don't think I only felt mostly exuberance in it, although I was getting a touch of a few dark, kind of sad things in people's lives that were basically mythologized, so that there was almost a levity that added to the gravity, to the pathos. And I did catch a bit of that, so maybe that comes out more and more. But what I'm noticing then, if that's the case, is that he sets up the thing that he felt is being lost really robustly to begin with, so that I suspect you're going to feel it as it gets lost. And I think that's all that stuff's important to remember, that if we're going to encounter the warts and all the flies in the ointment, or much worse than that, really problematic stuff, it is going to be surrounded by these other things going on in Lafferty's fiction, which has always been my thing about him, that he seems to have, and we'll get into this like a deep conversation about this some other time, but like I don't know what to call it, but just to put something in place there. I always feel he has something like a quote unquote liberal impulse that's almost battling
Well,
his
he
the
has those
harsher
moments, right?
aspects of his conservative impulses, and that's why so many left leaning people do still like him and stuff. And so I think that's what we're going to find in the Green Tree is we're going to find some of his ugly stuff really put out there, but also some of his most beautiful and generous type stuff going on at the same time, which just makes for interesting art, and we're allowed to just be critical about it and be like, nah, I'm not down with that, but look at this beauty, type of thing. So
Yeah.
that's my little take on In a Green Tree so far. So why don't you finish up any thoughts you have about this, and we'll maybe as a teaser to future things, we'll try to say a few things about
Yeah,
past
so
masters.
we go whatever series this ends up being. This is episode 0. This is
Yeah. Yes.
that's the way to go.
Exactly.
Like whatever this is the proto
Exactly.
episode.
Yes.
Um,
The
just to get some
primordial
base to
episode
get some
with Andrew
basics down
Ferguson.
there and some things because again I can riff on this stuff and just sort of hop from one thing to the next for literally pretty much forever.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
so
could listen to you do it.
it's um I'll say like so yeah obviously the hope is to get all the stuff out there all the unpublished stuff I think maybe again we'll see what ends up where the estate in is in a year is probably we'll see what can be done. I would like to get as much of it out as quickly out as possible, but
Mhm.
in actually good proofread editions would be also nice.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
we'll see what can be done there, but I do think a lot of this stuff will be getting out um, more and more. I'll try to put my thumb on the scale as much as
Yeah.
I can with that. I don't not
Let
like I have really real influence or anything,
I
but
want to jump in and add a note to all that stuff we said about the hardcore, dense, experimental, unpublished fiction. The chapters I read of Fair Hills of Ocean, I think it's
yeah,
called, um, were different in that regard. They were equally very strange and experimental,
yeah.
but that one was another rip roarer for me. It just skimmed along.
I would definitely think that's the one out of the ones that aren't series. Like I wanted, you got to get. I really wanted In a Green Tree out, and I'm
Yeah,
so happy that the team that's behind that took it over and is bringing it out there. I really want the other 2 Dana Cosquin books out. Following up on The Flame is Green and Half a
yeah,
Sky.
yeah,
I want those other 2 books out. I really want Esteban out. That's another one of
yes,
his historical fictions about
yes.
the black man who was the first white man, as in non-native to enter most of the American Southwest.
Uh-huh.
Again, there's going to be some interesting things once that's published for
Yeah,
sure. There's some
yeah.
interesting aspects, but there's so much outstanding stuff in there. But if I was to pick one just standalone, unpublished book, it would be Fair Hills of Ocean O. Would be the first one that I would send out
Mm,
there because I think it is more approachable. I think it's very fun. It's
yeah,
very
yeah,
Dolphin is the main character. That's
yeah.
just great. There's a lot there. And
That one could get some
already,
traction, I think.
already too, like you see there, like again, these little glimmers of Lafferty is like I think he complains and he's cranky about it, but he does have such a liberalizing impulse to himself.
Mm,
Like his definitions of the human, as you full well know, is massive. Like
mm,
the human expands to just cover just about any sort of creature capable of sort of
yeah,
sentience and emotion.
yes.
Serpent's egg, like it's like an unborn kangaroo and like an angel and like a wolverine and all
So
those
good.
other things. They're all
Yeah,
human though. They're
yeah,
all also human somehow.
yeah,
So like there's that in there. And so the dolphin just like fits right into those
mhm,
things.
yep,
The triple agent dolphin, Robert
yeah,
Liffey. And there's tie into Fourth Mansions, like Carmody Overlark, who appears in Fourth Mansions,
yeah.
as
Is
one
it?
of the main villains,
Yeah,
is also present in this
yeah.
book. So and I think again they all have their things that are worth digging into.
Mm,
Some are well obviously rougher, or more challenging going than others. But that one I would definitely want out there. Um, there's I could I probably we probably just do another time where I would just like go through. I can go through some of more of the unpublished stuff, especially since
yeah,
I don't have it
yeah.
as to hand as I have in the past.
Mm,
And I also want to get obviously all of his unpublished short stories, like even the Apprentice work. I would
mm,
really like to have out there, but I think out of his 40 odd 44 45 unpublished short stories, you
Mm.
know, 20 of them were really good and should have been published, you know,
Mm.
and the other 20 or so were mostly these sort of apprentice pieces
Yeah.
that were where he was figuring stuff out. And again, a lot of those have things to recommend them, and they're, you know.
Quick question on that. Would you consider, if you remember it, and I only barely remember it, but the story Chombo, would you consider that, which side of that would you consider that? An apprentice piece or?
That one to me is still an apprentice piece. I think it's a really good story. It's an
Yeah.
apprentice piece because that was one of the ones that he was writing specifically for his correspondence fiction course.
Yeah.
By the guy who was his first agent, which, you know, was sort of a borderline scam artist at that point. A guy who used to have connections, didn't really have connections anymore, was like gulling writers into, you know, take my course. If you pass it, you know, I'll be your agent. And then
Yeah.
like didn't really, you know, he placed a few things, but didn't really have the markets. He didn't know how to sell science fiction, especially. So, you know, eventually Fred Pohl said, you know, like, I don't know what's going on. You know, I've got, you're a writer that I want more stories from, but I can't seem to get your agent to send me any more stories,
Right.
which is
Well,
weird for an agent. Like,
yeah.
so.
The reason I ask about, it's just one of the ones I remember. I wonder, yeah, I could see it being one of the apprentice stories, but at the same time, I'll need to revisit it. At the same time, I thought it was one of the better, maybe like a kind of favorite story of mine. Like I really loved that
Yeah.
story. So even some of the apprentice work could come into the, you know, the pantheon of great stories we like by Lafferty, I think.
What's really great about those is you get those glimpses about like what author would he have been
Mm.
if he had sold elsewhere. Where would he what are other directions that he could have gone in? And I think he could definitely
And
write these suspense stories, these sports
yeah,
stories,
yeah.
these
In
other
Chombo,
pulp stories.
yeah, Chombo is like kind of a sports story. I forget if there's like boxing or what it
It's
is, but
boxing, yeah.
yeah, but like it definitely gives you the flavor of like everything you love about Lafferty and his whole tall tale vibe and all that, and the exuberance and the weirdness, like in a boxing story, it is how I remember it. And it's like, that is cool, man. I do like seeing Lafferty try other genres when he's in like full Lafferty mode, you know, doing this other genre. It still works, you know. Anyway, that's how it hit me. So anyway,
And
go on.
it's a borderland story, you know, because they're
Yes,
crossing over into
yes,
Mexico, and
yes,
that's one of his locations that he likes to sort of like think about and work with.
yep.
You know, after Tulsa, after Galveston, after a couple other places, he likes working on those borderland stories. Um, you know, these are we all have been places that he would have driven with his family when with
Mm,
like his family like took long road trips during like school summers.
yeah,
So they would drive up to all of these places, and so that's where
yeah,
he's speaking of his knowledge that he gleaned from that stuff.
yeah.
Um, so I think it's interesting. So you know, if I look over his whole career, you know, because he came to it late, because he had a sort of a, you know, a fully formed, you know, artistic, you know, mean to him. Like he had a, you know, he came in with a style. There's sort of a things that you wanted to do. So I think there's one very early novel, unpublished, again, called Antonino Vescovo.
Mm,
This is supposed it purports to be the biography of a 12th or 13th, something like that, century saint, Saint Antoninus. And you can look at it and you can tell it's very young. You can tell that
mm,
this is a work that I want to say I say this work specifically because this is the only work other than translated poetry and a couple other fragments that we have from before his lapse away from writing. So this is the work that
mm.
we have
Huh.
that he wrote when he was, you know, in his teens and early 20s, so somewhere along in there. I think maybe I think early 20s if I'm remembering right. Um, and you
Wow.
can see so many of his quirks and tricks and stuff there. If people who are interested, this is another. I think this would be another of the blog post I'm reasonably proud of. Is the Antonio Vescovo one, but
Yeah.
you can see like his long lists of things. You can see like his sort of audacity for things, like, you know,
Yes.
that he's just like making mincemeat of time and space and authorship and causality and all these things. And
Mm.
it's in some ways it's a very young man's work in a way that like maybe like there was a maturity, you know, I don't know how much of that sort of maturity he ever wanted to attain to, in the sense of like the sedateness or anything. But there's such a playfulness to it, and an idea of like I want to push these boundaries. What can I push against here in
Mm.
this? And of course, being him, he picked like this genre of the saint's life. That's what he chose to push against the
Yes.
boundaries of, right? Is It's like,
Great.
well, how can I make this really weird saint story? Um, and and there's so many there's some really interesting stuff in there. I think it's best read in smaller chunks. You know, there's some tedium. And I don't tedium not in his sense, but there's some things where like things don't quite come off. But
Mm,
it's filled with the same sort of experimentalism, and he's
mm,
figuring things out. And I do
yep,
again, you wonder what would have happened. Would he have been the same writer? Would
right.
if he just kept writing the whole way through? But because because he took that time, he arrived on the scene with like a fairly full formed
Yeah.
artistic consciousness, and he
Yes.
like just and he did need to learn how to turn out the works.
Hmm.
And so, if nothing else from that correspondence school of fiction, it said, okay, send me in a suspense story. That and he had to produce it to a deadline, and so he learned to produce those stories. He learned how to write manuscripts, how to count words,
Mm,
how to keep records and files for himself. Um, but once he gets going, he really just does pursue things where they go, and that
yeah.
consciousness sees him through. And he's just grasping at he's getting that glimpse of ever bigger and bigger things, grasping ever bigger and bigger
Yes.
things.
Yeah,
Um,
it's more than like maturity, so to speak. What I notice is he comes out of the gate. Yes, he's definitely initially like stumbling a bit, trying to kind of figure it all out. But what he seems to have from the get when he starts in the late 40s, when he's in his late 40s or whatever, is this confidence. Um, he's like a confident storyteller, and I do think that even ties to the confidence man. He's like
yeah,
a little bit of a bumbler right at first, just barely, but he's already like he's a con man with promise, man. He is going to start conning us all real good real soon. And if people want to know what I mean, you go look at Andrew's blog. He talks a fair bit about this in various stories. But Lafferty's whole con man aesthetic, kind of next to complementary with his liars aesthetic, is something he does formally and so on. But you really feel that snake oil salesman thing in the most entertaining way coming out of the gate when he comes back to writing, as you say. Yeah.
yeah, and
Well.
that's the one thing that he apparently couldn't bring himself to write about, much at all. Like little, again, a couple of stories, little bits and pieces, but is like his own wartime experiences. Like those
Mm,
are the ones that he doesn't, and that might be the thing. He writes about military guys all the time. He talks
mm-hmm.
about like how, like that's part of where he learned to lie the way he did. Is like
Yeah.
the stories they would swap when they're on off hours or just like in down times and things like that. But he didn't want to write about the actual hot times of war. He didn't want it. He didn't want to because there somewhere this haunts me that there is
Yeah.
somewhere maybe in a box. It
Yeah.
must be gone by now. But he
Mm,
did have an almost 500,000 word draft supposedly of Archipelago out
yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Where he tried to lay out all the things that he went through in the war, and he tried to
Yeah.
like, and now you go to Archipelago, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's probably one of my two or three favorite Lafferty novels.
Mm,
Um, but he's just wiped all of that out. Like it's everything else but that.
yes.
That's the
Yeah.
war. It's still a war novel, but it's everything but the war that
Yeah.
works in there.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, the interesting thing that comes out of that is, for me, I see all these implications of things you can speculate about his war experience and so on coming out through various stories and stuff. That, I mean, I would love to have it from the horse's mouth, but it's interesting to piece some of that together. So, for example, to me, in that story, Marsilia V,
Marsilia
um,
V, yeah,
I feel that Lafferty kind of is that. It's been a long time since I've read it, but that sensitive character that I think is drawing stuff, eh, in his sketchbook of wildlife and stuff, um, surrounded by the more uh, hyper masculine guys or whatever. Again, my memory of that story is pretty vague, but I got a notion of that kind of thing. And then I port over to like 900 grandmothers, and in a like, obviously he's sending up Kieran Swicegood to a certain extent, but
yeah,
he also is Kieran Swicegood
sure,
amongst.
yeah,
And we were having a huge laugh in this other panel video that I did on the whole Manbreaker Crag thing, and it was
yep,
really hitting me as we were talking about it. Like, this was like some sergeant or somebody that like Lafferty knew, that was like, why didn't you
Sure,
pick a
sure.
name like Gut Boy Barrel House, or whatever, like that. So I really think his experience in the war comes through. And then of course it comes through pretty explicitly in stories like Configuration of the North Shore and his time in the South Pacific and all that kind of stuff, in terms of at least atmosphere and, the island experience there, and, different, and that comes out in other stories as well. So yeah, it's that invisible thing that haunts you and haunts me too, and yet its invisible presence is felt in all these little places and stories and novels
Yeah,
throughout his work.
that's what he says. He says he talks about his ghost story again, like this. And
Yeah.
that's it. So when I do Lafferty, the one thing that's struck me with Lafferty research is like the right piece has always fallen to me at the right time.
Hmm.
And like so the first time I went to the Tulsa archive, before I was, when I was still considering going, I went to I flew out there, I took a tour, I saw the archives, and I dipped into it. Like I had like an hour or two to dip into them before I had to, like, that was all I had while I was there.
Mhm.
And so I
Wow.
was like, well, what can I grab that's like, I'm not going to see anywhere else. And so I started looking through these various fragments, just because, like, well, fragments, those aren't going to be published out there anywhere else. I don't have time to read an unpublished novel, sadly.
Right.
So I'm gonna look at these fragments. And I immediately stumbled on, what turned out to be a draft of the letter that goes with More Than Melchizedek, where he sort of talks about all of his stories ultimately being one story, but he pulls
Right.
in this sort of ghost story, this idea, and this idea that there's an underlay to his fiction that has
Mhm.
never really come quite to light. And that's,
Mhm.
I think, what we're getting at here, like,
Yes.
and sort of intuiting. And the more that you know about his Lafferty, the more
Yes.
you intuit that underlay, and you sort of
Yep.
like get the dimensions of it, even if you can never quite see it. You can see how
Yep.
it affects every other thing.
Yeah.
And he builds that into his ideas on world building, on world creation, and world destruction. He builds that, obviously, sort of into his ideas of salvation, of soteriology and communion.
Wow. Yeah.
He builds this obviously into his ideas of various sorts of community.
Yep.
One of my regrets of the research, I came to it too late, really, to get in touch with his old army buddies, who were his,
Mm.
he went to science fiction conventions, but what he really, really loved every year was going to the reunion of his, anti-aircraft battery that they would
Mm.
have, somewhere around the country every year. And there were named people there who are like, pulled into his fiction, or very clearly pictured in his fiction. In his letters, he talks about kind of who was who. Even though, and Finnegan, he says, is like as a composite of a few guys, but other guys were like pretty much pulled in straight as they were. And so you sort of you get the sense of that experience
Yeah.
that's there. And I
Yes.
guess it is sort of like fitting that his personnel record was basically destroyed in a fire in this big 1973 warehouse fire that happened at the military personnel record center in St. Louis. And that's one thing I do still need to get. I do still need to give them money so that they can try to piece together the fragments of what may or may not be there still.
Right.
But we'll see. We'll see if anything else comes out of there. But yeah, that's you, and you get that sense in that him again towards the rest of his life, he's getting the shape of it. I think of the Six Fingers of Time. You sort of get the maybe the darker image of this, of like this guy who he squandered his time on a lot of different things, and like he's figures out, oh, now I can move fast, I can do these things, I can learn what I need to learn, and he doesn't quite get there, And I
Yes.
think that's sort of what Lafferty is. There's an image of Lafferty himself, even at that
Wow.
in his life, like and that's one of his first stories.
Wow.
That's a
Yeah.
1958 story, something like that. But that's like, thinking about how much time do I have? Like now I've discovered something that will help me move fast, which is writing fiction, which is getting these things on paper. But how do I get to the point where, where I can actually get at the big pattern that I intuit is there? And he keeps trying to do it. He keeps trying to get there. And that's a big part of the quest that he seems to be on.
I
And I
can't.
think that all readers of us are with him.
I've never thought of the sped up time in his work having that application, and I agree. I think he's doing a lot of stuff there, but it's like, because it comes up again and again, Lord Torpedo, Lord Gyroscope, and Slow
Yeah.
Tuesday Night, and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, to that point about late in life and having that one thing, so much of what you've been saying has really helped illuminate this part for me. What I've been noticing for years with that late stuff, I've been really surprised that like so many of the novels explicitly deal with the almost like rights and responsibilities, as well as the joys and sorrows of being a writer. Like
Yeah, no, no,
what
no,
I
that's really
keep
true.
saying is like it's like his vocation as a writer was like weighing on him in those late novels, because like East of Laughter in particular and Sindbad are two that come to mind, where it's like all about writers and writing the
The
world.
challenge that, yeah, but I mean, Annals of Plebiscite starts like is the arrival of a historian, right,
Right,
of writing history. Yeah, the
right.
Serpent's Egg is revealed at the end to be all in a series of
Oh,
inscriptions like
yes,
by a louse, on a
yes,
whale
yes,
epic, cenotaphs.
yeah,
This is the thing, like, so yeah, he's very obsessed with the process of writing, what it means to write, what it means to tell stories.
yeah.
I would think like I think he probably, many obviously writers are obsessively thinking about this, but like the only one I could think of who thinks about these things on a comparable depth of level would be somebody like Alan Moore, who like,
Mm,
very explicitly ties it to this framework of magic, not necessarily just as ceremonial magic, but magic as like an application of will. And that
mm,
stories can very much be an application of will
mm,
to move things in certain
mm.
directions, and like
Yeah.
that produces real effects in the world.
Hmm.
That you're using words, you're using language to change like the physical, like the actual physical material world.
Yeah.
And that is magic,
Yeah.
and as anybody could, broken down in those terms, anybody could sort of see, oh, you
Yeah.
don't mean like, oh, you're casting a literal spell and like, you're catching a bush on fire or something. No,
Yeah.
you mean producing a change
Yeah.
through this word. And Lafferty is doing, I think he would obviously reject
Mm.
magical framework of it, but maybe not. I mean, I think
Yeah.
like he would see it would see at least similar ways of yeah, the responsibilities, like the enormous ethical responsibilities of the writer. That's his one speech that he gave, the day after the world ended, is all about like, no, like we science fiction writers have a responsibility to create worlds, and you're not doing it. Like
Yeah.
you're not doing it. You do, or do it better. We need to do this better. We need
There,
more worlds, and this
there's
is
a
this is
couple.
something that they are
Yeah.
charged with doing.
Yeah. There's a couple phrasings in East of Laughter where he talks about the weight upon these giants who have to live for 1,000 or
Yeah.
thousands of years writing the world, and they are poignant. Like they really hit me, and like it's a strange image too, because why does he make them like thousands of years old, and how does that relate to being a human writer and stuff? But there's a pathos there, and it works, and it's like this deep mythic metaphor talking about the weightiness of writing. And yeah, I don't know, just the mantle of that and stuff, and how it needs to be passed on. And, oh, it's powerful stuff. And that's the thing, is like, in addition to all these other things we're talking about, for those interested in the whole craft of writing, the whole idea and process of writing, what it is, what it can do in the world, all in Lafferty's body of work in general, and then specifically in a lot of these late novels, there's a treasure trove on this topic, just waiting to find its readership. I think some people are going to really, really value this in the future. Maybe I'm talking in Laffertian terms about the future, by the way.
Right, of
Like
course, yeah.
his whole provisional, maybe this is going to happen in the future, and we're kind of, the Argo kind of popping into the future to try to work a few things out, from the present. I don't know if you remember that whole thing with time
Well,
in more than
yeah, the
Melchizedek.
the other candidate, I don't think it was the last thing he wrote, but it definitely was one of the very last things he wrote, which was, just sort of this coda to the Argo books, to the Argo series, which is the little pamphlet book called the Anamnesis.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, which is it would ends in like basically like, it's getting people together as for a wedding. It's a wedding feast, but it's also very explicitly a communion feast. It's
Mm,
it's a gathering, it's community, and like that's the thing that he really, I would certainly believe just from what he left, but I think, would like to think also besides. I think that's what, he might be embarrassed that people were like discussing his works, and he might be furious at what I do with some of his works. I don't know, but like,
yeah.
but at the same time, I think like the idea of people coming together to discuss those things, and then but more importantly, to use those to build and to make changes in our world.
Yeah.
The world, it's the world we have. We can
Yeah.
build more and try to like push it certain ways. And that's what science fiction allows us to do. I think it's what world building generally allows us to do, is to test the boundaries of the world, and can't we make it a little bit
Yeah.
different? Can't we do it?
Yeah.
Can't we do things differently?
Yes.
Than the way they're being done. And I think that's the charge that you get coming out of a big burst of Lafferty is not, it's not so much that there is the crankiness, there is sort of like there is some dourness at times when he's like, I think really it is more like darker moods. I think maybe more depressive states from time to time, but at the same time, like, he ultimately says like, no, like art and creation, and which he would put in the explicitly obviously Catholic context, but even so, he says, well, we have to have something. And if it's not going to be Catholicism, if it's not going to be like some sort of we have to have a world to build
Mm.
on, and it's going to be involve all of us coming together to build this world collaboratively and to sustain it together.
Yeah.
That's what we have to do.
Yeah.
And that again, I think is an enormously resonant charge. And I think what I hope that people coming to his fiction will be able to take away, and will be able to see in it and take it to their own milieus, to take it to their own
Yeah.
to their
Yeah.
own corners of the world, and work to improve them and to create new and better things there.
Well, speaking of past master, um, that's why I think you can't just call it an anti-utopian book, because if Lafferty doesn't like utopia or believe in it in any sense, that doesn't mean he doesn't want to build a world and build a better world. So it's there, and I think his vision of it in terms of like its process and different things is quite beautiful. And your scholarly reaction to that and your like taking up of that call and passing that call on is also beautiful. So to round out our episode 0 here as a teaser to talking more about past master in episode 1 and onward of this discussion, yeah, can we say a few things about past master in closing? And
Sure.
I can yeah, go ahead.
So it's one of the first books that first novels that he published. Not the first novel he wrote by any means, but is one of the first that rolls off. He has a remarkable year that year that has Past Master, Space Shanty, and Reefs of Earth all come out, within really just a couple months of each other. So it's like it would have been like people would have been seeing. If you're a reader of science fiction, you keep up with the field. You know the name Lafferty. You've seen him. He's been in the books. He's been in pretty good magazines. Everything except Analog Astounding, which I don't think he ever had any use for John Campbell.
Yeah.
And John Campbell didn't have any use for him.
Right.
But and then all of a sudden, like bam, 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 these novels hit. Like and that's something. It's Past Master's an ace book. As Space Shanty is an ace double. Reefs of Earth is another. What was that? It was a Ballantine book. Oh, we did Reefs of Earth originally. You can tell how out of practice I am here.
Yeah.
Even so, he's coming out of these major science fiction presses, and they keep rolling out for a while. And then Virginia Kidd picks him up, and she succeeds in getting these sort of other books, placed, things like that. But Past Master really sets for a lot of people what their expectation of him is going to be. So they might have read Space Shanty, they might have read Reefs of Earth, but it seemed like every science fiction author at least was familiar with Past Master. They all at least took a swing at it. Many of them responded, and again, as you said, many people who were very opposed to it. I'm looking at this version right here. This old, or probably the original one, the Age Science Fiction. Oh, I got to put it in front of my face again. Yeah. I don't remember. There we go. Has a Judith Merrill quote on it. Judith Merrill, who would not have been a fan of any of his takes on the politics of the day or anything. In fact, she was. I've got to do an article at some point about how she was the one who ultimately helped organize and spearhead the anti-Vietnam War advertisements that prompted the pro-Vietnam War advertisements. I say pro-Vietnam War, they would have said, "Oh, we've made a promise to the Vietnamese people that we need to uphold." That would have been the position that they were saying. They're not. They would nobody. I don't think most people say I'm pro-war. I want to continue with this, but we made a promise, and Lafferty, was on that side, although he wasn't dogmatic in that way. He very much opposed the Desert Storm. He was very opposed to the initial invasion of Iraq in in 19 whatever it was, in George H.W. Bush's.
Yeah.
Anyway, the side point there. But Taskmaster is what people came to associate him with and to expect. Like, okay, we're going to get some philosophical science fiction. There's going to be these overtones of Catholicism. We're going to get some wild stuff in there. And by and large, that's what, he gave them for a period of time, through
Mm.
until, the 1974 or so. So he had like,
Mhm.
5 or 6 years where he was really didn't have any problem selling anything. And again, Kid helped with this. She's an amazing agent. One of my dream projects would be to do the Virginia Kid biography. If I could just like,
Mhm.
carry on from the Lafferty biography to the
Yeah.
Kid biography, but that would be even, there's a lot more sources that would need to go into that.
Mm.
But you know, that I, that as long as he was doing that, and I think there are other factors as to why his career slacked off. Part of it was he was writing very weird stuff, and this sort of big fiction style marketing efforts, and tools for tracking what sold and didn't sell or what moved units started to move science fiction away from experimental stuff for a while, towards away from the really really experimental stuff of the new wave. Um, People, other sort of his taste changed, other things happened.
I'm
And
just going to jump in to say that it's weird too, that not weird, it's almost tragic that in some ways to me he was like hitting his stride around that point, with not to mention Camels and Three Armageddons of Enniscorthy Sweeney, just when there
that's
was
the
going to
era,
be
yeah,
no readership for that stuff. You know what I mean?
yeah,
It's like incredible stuff, but go ahead.
yeah. And I think that did throw him for a little while, like that throw him. And he was fortunate that he did make enough money off of Oklahoma that he didn't need to make any money off of his fiction as much. It was nice to have, but it wasn't. He was comfortable enough by that point. At that point he was just living. He and his sister Anna, had the house that they had, both of them, of course, never married. None of the Lafferty kids ever married.
Huh.
Um, the they he was comfortable enough in life. What does he say? He's like, I wasn't
Yes.
on easy street, but I was on easy alley.
Yeah.
That was that, which is better for a person of my predilections. Is always the line that he had for it. But so I think there were a number of people who were always just like, well, why can't you do another Passmaster?
Mm.
Why can't you just dig back in and give us that? And even Kid, she regretted saying this, and I think even as she was writing it, in some points, like, why can't you give me another one like this one? Why can't you give me another continued on Next Rock? Why can't
Mm.
you give me another, another, one of these? And he was like, he was producing what he could, and he was like, but I did give you one of these. I gave you one, and he
Yeah.
points to, again, one of my all-time favorite short stories, and I was so glad that this made it into the best of, which was a Selenium Ghost of the
Hmm.
1870s, which
Hmm.
is just a wildly, like, just obscenely almost like experimental story. Like, there's no
Hmm.
way that story should be written. Um, I,
Totally.
I've read so much media theory about the early days of television, just trying to help me make sense of that story and
Mm.
why it affects me the way it does. And even Kid just bounced off of it. She would sell it, but
Mm.
it just wasn't she what she was expecting, what she kind of came in mind to think. And like, he was publishing all of these different things. He had the things he wanted to finish in the Green Tree. He wanted to finish the Dana Cosplin books and all these things that for a lot of people would regard it to as, I think what's Klute's phrase in the science fiction encyclopedia is like, that he just leaned into sort of like an intensification of the oddity of his product.
Mhm.
And if I, I just don't think it was a choice for him. Like, he had to pursue it where it went.
Yes.
And we can go back to Passmaster, but now I think we can also go back to Passmaster, and we can
Yeah.
say, though, actually, it was this weird to start with. It
Yeah.
was always this weird. Like, to the degree that people were like, oh, this is a really fun kind of philosophical science fiction story. Why can't you just sort of like do one of those again? Like, and then you go back and you're like, no, there's some incredibly weird and weighty stuff here. Like, why
Yeah.
why is any of this? Why is some of this stuff in here? What is it doing?
Yeah.
He's and yeah, so I think you can see so much of his career embedded in it. Some of the things that he would approach there. Again, he regarded all of them as he came to regard them all as one work. Every facet's going to reflect every other. Um, And those are the things I hope, in these sorts of conversations and in conversations with among other Lafferty people. And I hope, obviously the hope is in a wider, ever widening circle of readers that
Yeah.
they'll come to this and they'll see those things and they'll want to play their own part, do their own
Yes.
collaboration with us to help put piece this together and make sense of it in the wider sense of having a world together that we're
Yep.
that we're all building. This is
Yeah.
a tool to help us. It's not ultimately even a tool to help us understand Lafferty. It's a tool to help us build a world that is livable. That
Yeah.
we could actually live in, rather than the lack of a world that he
Yeah.
diagnosed so often, that this flat land that we've relegated to.
Yeah.
We want
And that
real
is,
peaks and real depths, and we want
yeah.
real dimensionality to
Yeah.
our experience. And damn it, it needs to be fun too.
Yeah. That's right. Yes. And that is the formal call of his fiction. And I learned that from you. And I've never stopped passing it on. Like, it's like fundamental to me about Lafferty at this point, that, it's the stories and the novels and so on are built to be open-ended and open out to the reader going, okay, I'll take it from here. You know what I mean? He's
Mhm.
calling us all to do that, to get our hands dirty, to get in here, to build the world, which is,
Yeah,
I mean, how many writers, as you say, all fiction does these kinds of things. All fiction is dialogic and all these different things. But like, how many writers, you know, put that out on the surface and say, as I put it recently, like, leave the sutures into their Frankenstein's creature and just say, I've pasted this all together. Everybody come in and get a piece, add a piece. Does anyone else have something further to add as
right.
the
Yeah, yeah,
last
yeah,
line?
yeah.
So
And
yeah,
bricolage is never a stopping point. It's never
mm,
it's never static. The point is to continue accruing and to continue like adding on pieces and discarding things that don't work anymore and adding in new ones and like piecing them together. That's how things keep going. That's how you
yes,
get the ship of Theseus, right? Is like it's still the ship. It's still the Argo. You've changed every piece of it, but
yeah,
it's the Argo all the same. So
yeah,
I'm gonna finish up by actually like going away from Lafferty towards something that I've been fascinated by in the last few years. Something that's come up that reminds me greatly of him, and because it's the same sort of invitation to create, to collaborate. It's the same sort of thing, like let's open up these works and do new things with them. This is a video art collective that formed during the pandemic. It was mostly board. It was almost entirely board, like early to mid-career film professionals. So people who were stuck at home. There's no shoots anymore. There's no work to be done. So they're just stuck. And so what they're doing largely is watching movies in chat rooms on Twitch. They're watching movies and chatting about them. And one of them gets the idea. They're watching the Wachowski siblings, the Wachowski sisters, Speed Racer,
mm,
which is also a gorgeous movie to revisit. It's so
mm,
fun. It's so underappreciated in so many ways. But
mm.
and one of the guys says, I always wanted to do a vaporwave recut of Speed Racer. I
Nice.
always wanted to do this, and so he goes away and actually like does like the first like 60 seconds of Vaporwave Speed Racer, and
Wow.
other people are just like, I want to do that, and so they all start like, adding pieces on it. But the next thing they know, 24 hours later, maybe 48 hours later, I forget the story, they have a full cut, an hour-long cut of Speed Racer in Vaporwave style. And they
Wow.
broadcast it, and they watch it, and they watch it again, and they watch it again, and like this is amazing. And the next month they do another movie. And then they keep on adding on, and they did this for a year and a half, 2 years. They under the name Racer Trash, which was picked up from Speed Racer, the movie. And it's this art form that is like I think of it as maximalist remix, because
Mm,
they're taking like source materials from these films, but then they are taking grabbing anything that comes to mind. So they'll
mm,
grab commercials, songs, that they'll run it through all these video filters and analog filters and things like that. So there's like video artistry, but there's like bits, like there's just comedy bits that they'll
mm.
put into it. And it's narrative film, but it's in a way that it's so gonzo, and it is an extremely ADHD form, so it's not surprising I
Yes.
took to it. But in the same way that I think that Lafferty presents us with just like this overwhelming barrage of symbolism and metaphor, and there's so
Yeah.
many things happening. And you
Mm,
just like you look at the screen, and it's not just the screen, because you're also watching it while chat is happening. So like people are chatting at the same time. So you're keeping up with these multiple streams. And it gave me the same sort of feeling that I got, going into Lafferty, for the first time or coming back to him after a while away. It's just like, wow, and going into Past Master this time, it's just like, there's so much happening. In every
Yeah.
stage of this, there's just so
Yeah.
much. Like I want to pull every part of this. I want to like analyze it frame by frame, word by word. I want to go in like, what are you doing here? How did you make this happen? How does this work? That all these different people are bringing these pieces together into something so much bigger than they could
Mm.
have done by themselves. And this is not just to advertise Racer Trash. It's not a going thing anymore. They sort of splintered after a while, as artist collectives tend to do. There's there's a group called Dream Video Division that's picked up the slack. And then, I think the more important thing is two important things. One is they didn't take any money for it. And this is not to say that all taking money for art is bad, but what they funneled into getting donations for various people. So immediately after, they was the George Floyd murder happened after, in the wake of them making their second movie, which was they did a recut of Heat, and so they collected money for bail funds for people who were out protesting, and they did these for various causes. Each time they did a stream, they said, okay, if you've enjoyed this, donate the cost of a movie ticket to this thing. They do some good with that.
Yeah.
So I think that was really interesting. And again, it's a way of building a world and making that change in the world and using art specifically to
Yeah.
channel towards that. But the other thing is they inspired other people to pick up the tools of this. Like, anybody could pick up a video editor. You could pick up a free video editing suite and go to work on a movie and do something similar. Maybe you're not a whiz with, an Adobe whiz or whatever, but you can do something. You can do something. And that's a very big part of it too, is like, let's pick this up and see where it goes. What other things can we do with this? And again, Lafferty is always about what other worlds can we create? What can this do? That old chestnut of a phrase. The purpose of a system is what it does. What's the purpose of science fiction? What is it doing? What is it doing right now? What has it done? Because that's what its purpose is. If its purpose is actually to create worlds, it should be creating worlds. If its purpose is to pump out, to extrude tedium, in digestible, marketable forms, then that's its purpose. But that's really up to us to decide what we're going to do with this thing and what we're going to make that purpose to be, and to make sure that it does have a purpose that's worth having.
That's amazing. That's a wonderful close. And watchers of this channel will know that this connects directly to some things I've been talking about with ludic mythopoesis on the back of reading Lafferty and discussing him. And it connects to something I wrote on my Substack about like this upgrade of reading Past Master based on a Borges story and all these kinds of things. Yeah, to build the world in ways that tend toward justice, for example. And what one last thing I'll say then that it's making me think of in that regard is that Lafferty definitely wanted certain things to happen and not happen. So he kind of did us a favor in his way, like showing us just where he stands on a lot of stuff, so that we could just be like, okay, that's where you're at, and we will deal with that how we deal with that. But on the other hand, he also seems to understand that this level of community creativity and participation in bricolage was not in his control, and he didn't even try to make it in his control. And the speech that you often reference about building the world has ended, let's build a new one, he seems to explicitly say, like, there's no rules, just do it, you know what I mean? Like, and you don't have, he doesn't say, so everybody, here's the catechism, start building off of this. He's just like, it's whatever. The point is, we have a moment of intense creativity here in science fiction, in the state of the world, and so on. The point here is to be creative, you know what I mean? And to build, rather than like, here's my heavy-handed program for what to do, which is just, really fascinating. And it really, I feel that even when we take it in directions we know he wouldn't have liked or something in some respects, I don't think he would have been against it, a lot of it in spirit. But we can, not that we need this, but it's kind of nice to know that he did give us some permission to do this, to take it in the directions that we choose. He said, does anyone else have something further to add? And he didn't put restrictions on that. So yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was a rich conversation. Thank you so much for making the time
Thank
to
you so
do
much.
this.
I'm so glad we could work it out finally, and I'm always so happy to get a chance to talk to dive back into Lafferty, and because that's what that's what really makes me want to go back.
Yeah,
And I always want to go back and read Lafferty, but like there's so many other things that I'm like I've got to get done and stuff. Like it gives me the impetus of like, no, I need this for myself. I need this
yeah.
for my own creativity. I need this
Mm.
for my own edification is the wrong word because it sounds so like wooden and so.
Yeah,
But I just need this for my own soul. My own
yeah,
creative soul needs to get
yeah,
back in touch with like the amount of potential that
yeah,
he opens up, that he looses into the world.
yeah,
Um, and that is not a finite resource, thankfully.
yeah.
Yeah.
I love how throughout this video we've become like the prophets or something of Lafferty. We're like, there's so
So
much
yeah,
potential
we
here.
can pull it down a little bit, but this is getting back into touch for me, and it's getting me back into this territory of and of the potential of fiction and creativity and
Yeah,
what can be done with it.
yeah.
So I'm sure again I'll be more I'll be back to more cynicism on some occasions, but sometimes
Hey,
you just gotta you gotta
no,
embrace it, have
we
real
need
feelings.
we need it. We need it, man. When it comes, let it happen. It's good. It's good. Right. Well, I guess we'll draw it to a close there. And thanks to everybody for watching. Get into the comments. Say what you think about all this stuff that we've brought up. Your maybe even your questions regarding Lafferty and his life and his writing and things that have come up through this conversation. I can't guarantee we'll answer everything or right away, but it's if you comment and ask questions, it's stuff that we can consider covering in the future, for example, in addition to hopefully trying to talk with you in the comments to some degree and talk to each other. So thanks again, Andrew, and thanks to everybody for watching. We'll see you soon with more Lafferty content. Take
Thanks,
care.
Ganelle.
Bye.
The amniotic ontic webbing is torn, and some black galactic thing is born. The star should